I think that when we have to assess what parts of the tefillah we're going to attend fully and what parts perhaps less so, we have to determine what are the essential parts of the tefillah and what are less essential, what are primary, what are secondary. So I'm going to ask you, halachically speaking, what is the central tefillah, the most important tefillah throughout Yom Kippur, without even a question? An open. Yes. What is it? No. Halachic. Totally not halachic. In terms of the custom, there are some halachic authorities that object to saying Kol Nidre. You may or may not know that, but it's become steeped in Jewish tradition that became the. But halachically speaking, it has very little significance. But as what? Zidoy and the 13 midot. And how do I know that the 13 midot? You could say the Zidoy. What are the 13 midot? What are the 13 midot? Let's say the Zidoy and the 13 midot. How do I know? How do we know that the
I'll tell you. Good answer. 4 times. And how many times do we recite the Yudgila Midot on Tfilat Ne'ilah? It's a magic Jewish number. Come on. What's the magic Jewish number? No, not that many times.
7.
7. So we start Yom Kippur, it's 7 times, and we conclude Yom Kippur, sorry, it's 4 times, and we conclude Yom Kippur, it's 7. It's a magical formula. And so if you had to choose parts of the Tfilah to attend, the Vidui would certainly be one, and the recitation of the Yudgila Midot would be another. Okay? By the way, Slichot that we say throughout the week, throughout the month, whatever it is, whenever you start saying Slichot, it's the central piece of the Slichot Tefillah, is the Yudgila Midot. Okay. Why is this the central piece of the Tefillah? Somebody already alluded to it. Why is it so important to recite these Yudgila Midot? Go ahead. Because I think someone said it.
Yeah, because this was what Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu. This is the way you can attend Tefillah.
Okay, beautiful. So if you all have this source sheet, we're going to read the source sheet. It says it's a Gemara Rosh Hashanah that addresses it's very. Vayavo Hashem al panav vayikra. It's the very first text of the basic Gemara Rosh Hashanah. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Imalei mikra katuv efshar le'omo. If it had not been written, we couldn't actually say it. That God, as it were, covered himself with a talit as if he were a shliach tzibur. Then Moshe said this, and he's showing Moshe how to daven. Amarlo, Hashem said to God. Sorry, Hashem said to Moshe, Kol zman sheYisrael chotim yasu lefanai kaseder hazeh. Whenever they sin, they should recite this formula. It's like a magic formula. And I forgive. So Rabbi Yochanan is basically saying, if you want to achieve or to attain forgiveness, atonement, recite this formula. Recite it over and over again. The more the merrier, so to speak. Because that somehow impacts God. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Brit Kruta L'Shloshes Midot, She'enan Chozrot Lekam. There was a covenant established with regard to the 13 midot that will not go unanswered. If you recite them enough, right? If you say them, God can't completely ignore when we recite this form. So this has come to be, we refer to it as Yudgila Midot because Rabbi Yehuda says Yudgila Midot. But it's interesting that when Rabbi Yehuda refers to Yudgila Midot, what word does he not include? In describing these midot of God, he doesn't say Rachamim. He doesn't say their midot are Rachamim. We just assume, because that's how colloquially it has become known. It's become known as Yudgila Midot are Rachamim. And as a result, because we're reciting, logically speaking, we're reciting God's attributes of mercy, and therefore we hope that by reciting, instead of buttering him up, so to speak, the same way you tell someone You flatter him. You're such a nice person. You're such a good person. Just a kind person. How can you not be kind? We were constantly reminded with his kindness, and that's his nature. So it makes sense. God sort of has this weakness that you butter him up and flatter him the way we have weaknesses to flatter. You call it a weakness, you call it a strength. But most of us respond well to flatter. Not all, but most of us respond well to flatter. You're such a nice person. How could you? So apparently it works. It works. It doesn't work fully, it doesn't, but it has an impact. God can't ignore it. And then, hence, when the tefillah was established, it became a centerpiece of the tefillah. Makes perfect sense. There's only one little teeny tiny problem, which we're going to notice as we move along. Now, what is this whole thing based on? When did God first introduce these Middot, Rachamim or otherwise? At what point in history did God introduce this Middot? Anybody know? No. It's in the Torah.
Where did he put it on?
Yes. Where did
At
we
the time when Moshe Rabbeinu went up with the second, after he broke the.
Correct. It's after Chet. It's after Chet. And if you open up to Shemot Perek Lamed, we'll have a Tanakh. We'll read it. It's most Lamed Dalet. Let's say Lamed Dalet. Okay. Let's just give the context. So, as you said, what's your name? Tova. So, as Tova said correctly, the luchot were broken. Moshe broke the luchot. And now God says to Moshe, please, right, carve out two tablets of stone, and as the first ones, and I will give you once again an certain. So, but in the meantime, even before this, Moshe is concerned that the sin of the Chet Ego, even though God is allowing them to have a second tablets, Moshe is concerned that at the end of the day, God will not forgive. And so, if you look back at the end of Perek Lamed, I'll just read it to you. God, or Moshe wants to know something about God. He says, I want to know in Pasuk Lamed Gimel, read it to you. Okay, I want to know who you are. Please show me your attributes. Okay, and okay, so God at this point, after he tells them to carve out the second luchot in Perek Lamed, then God reveals his attributes. Okay, as Moshe requested, in the sense of a hope to gain forgiveness. So God then reveals his attributes. So if you look at Pasuk Hey, Pasuk Hey, the Lord came down in a cloud. He stood with him there and proclaimed the name Lord. Okay, this is it. Hashem, Hashem, Evachu v'chanun erech havayit v'chesed ve'emet. נוצא חסד לאלפים, נושא עוון ופשע וחטאה, ונקה לא ינקה, פוקד עוון אבות על בנים, ועל בני בנים על שלישים ועל בני. Let me translate. So, the Lord passed before Moshe, and proclaimed, the Lord, the Lord. Why is God saying the Lord is talking about himself? We're not getting into the parsha of this. A God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children, upon the third and the fourth generations. Now I'm going to ask you again. These are the Middot of God. These are the attributes of God. But I ask you again, are these Middot of mercy? Oh, you think it's a trick question? Kacha. What is your name? Leah. Go ahead, Leah. Elaborate.
You have a dual part here.
Beautiful.
What you have over here is there's a forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
There's a forgiveness.
Yes.
On the other hand,
Yes.
you're not clear. In other words, if you're standing in court, what you have over here is you're being told yes and no. That's all I can say.
You are 100% right. You're 100% right. It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. Now, there's no question that on balance, there's a great deal more of mercy. Because look, just look at the number. We're going to count. Forget the 13. I don't want. There's a whole debate about which are the 13. Forget the word for the number 13. Compassionate, gracious, slow to anger. I'm reading the English translation. Abounding in. I can read it in Hebrew. Hashem may be considered right when we go to Rachamim. Okay. El Rachum, Chanun, Erech Apayim, Vav Chesed Demet. Translation: God, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness. Right, continue. The extends kindness to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the third and fourth generation. On balance, there's a heck of a lot more mercy than there is called justice or retribution. But to say that this is entirely mercy, it's a misrepresentation of the text. No. Indeed, right? Right? It's saying, but yet, all this good stuff, yet it's not complete, but he can't just erase everything. God might be compassionate, but he's not 100%. There's a balance here, even though the weight of the balance is more in favor of mercy. If you look at the source sheet, I actually read the translation. Look at the source sheet. Text number 2. Number 3. JPS, the Lord, you can read what I just read to you. A God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness, which I read. Yet he does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children, upon the third and the fourth generation. Robert Alter's translation, very similar. Yet he does. The first one was JPS, is Rabbi. Yet he does not fully quit reckoning the crime of fathers, sons, and sons of sons to the third generation. And is there anything that I said here that's not shot? No. Good. Thank you. What's your name? Hadas. Okay. So we're reading shot. Now let's look at this thing. The mosque. Text number 5. This is the tefillah we cite over and over and over again. It's the and during Yom Kippur.
Technical note. When someone in the audience asks a question, you can repeat their question.
Oh.
On Zoom, they don't hear.
Got it. Excellent. I will do that. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure. Let's read from the Machzor. It's text number 5. Melech Yoshev at Tisei Rachamim. Mitahei b'chasidut. Mochel avonot amo. Ma'avir rishon. God sits on the throne of mercy. He acts with kindness. He forgives sins. Right. The first thing he erases. Okay. He multiplies this mechila, forgiveness. Right. You never punish them based on their evil conduct. And you taught us to say these 13 attributes. Because you taught us now. Remember the covenant through the recitation of the 13 Middot. As you instructed Moshe, years ago. This is the puzzle. Hashem kel rachum v'chanun erech apayim al chesed be'emet. Nuseh chesed la'alafim, nuseh avod v'fesha v'chata'ah v'nateh. End. Period. If you don't believe me, take a machzor and see. I didn't bring a machzor. Trust me. Oh, I think you know where I'm going. I see the face, Leah. Leah has a facial expression. It expresses some astonishment. Go ahead, Leah. You speak up.
You do not see here the iniquity. You do not see here the fact that there still has to be punishment for the 4th generation.
When you say we don't see, that's a nice way of putting it. How else could we put this?
It doesn't appear.
It doesn't appear, which means that someone deliberately omitted the second half. It's not a half, the third of the attributes of God. Deliberately omitted the last section. But it gets worse.
Motivational.
What?
It's motivational.
Hold on. Oh, it gets worse. Look at the last word of the section. What's the problem with the last word? Look at it carefully and then look back in the book. Oh, which means what? Which means what?
Which is that it's not quite the basic formula we thought it was.
No. What are the? Frank, are any of you familiar with Tommy Amikra? Or any of you? Would you like to lay in the pasuk for us? Go back to text number 2 and lay it. If you're uncomfortable, I'll do it. But you're okay with it, then do it. What? Okay. You got it, what's that? Okay, you're working. Okay, so I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna read it the way the Tommy Amikra tells us. Vayavol Adonai Adonai Vayikra Adonai Adonai Evachu V'chanun Erech Apayim V'chesed Emet Notze Chesed Alafim Nosei Avon V'pesha V'chatav V'nakein Lo Yenaked Okay Avon Al Banim Val B'nei Banim Al Shilishim Al Ribeim. What did you get from that reading? Look at the word v'nakeh. What is v'nakeh connected to? V'nakeh lo yenakeh. Because in terms of ta'am and mikra, there's a ta'am misharek and ta'am mafsi. V'nakeh cannot be separated from the lo yenakeh. It goes together. V'nakeh lo yenakeh. It's a biblical way of saying things. Sometimes words repeat themselves. V'nakeh lo yenakeh. Translated here, yet he does not remit. Yet he does not remit all punishment. Or yet he does not wholly equate. You cannot separate v'nakeh from lo yenakeh. You can't. Now I have to tell you, the shear that I'm giving today was prompted by my sensitivities about freedom. I'm about freedom. And for years, it bothered me. How on earth could the centerpiece of the tefillah of Yom Kippur, of the Yom Middot, literally distort, twist, subvert, undermine, turn upside down the word v'nakeh, which is supposed to be v'nakeh lo yenakeh, and take the word completely out of context and put a period after v'nakeh to suggest that what? Instead of v'nakeh lo yenakeh is an attribute of God's justice and punishment and retribution, they turn v'nakeh into what? An attribute of chesed and mercy. V'nakeh. If I hear v'nakeh, I'm saying, oh, God wants us clean. So what have I done? Not only have I omitted the last section, which talks about punishment for the third and fourth generation, I have taken the word v'nakeh, separated from what clearly goes after it, lo yenakeh, v'nakeh lo yenakeh, which is linked directly with the third section, namely retribution. And I have separated it such that I am giving that I'm associated or assigning it a meaning that means the exact opposite of what it's supposed to mean. And that has driven me out of my mind for years. And it still does. That's what this year is about. We're going to try to make sense of this anomaly. Disturbingly out of place, undermining the very core, the meaning of the word. Now, you're going to say, that this is a way of what? Motivating Who are we turning to? Who are we appealing to? Who are we appealing to when we say these words?
When we say it in the format that we say it.
Yes.
So we're saying it to people who might otherwise despair of ever getting.
Hold on. We're not saying it to people. We're saying it to whom? We're saying it to God. Now, guys,
But I'm saying in terms of what
hold on. Patience. But let's take a shot. We're appealing to God. How are we appealing to God? By distorting the very statement that he made about his attributes. By undermining, by lying to him about what his attributes really are. He said, those are God's words. And we say, God says, and we believe that. And we expect this formula to work. It's one thing. If you want to recite a formula, God's formula, in God's words, and hope that that will have an impact. But to distort God's words, almost I don't know how to say it. The metzach nechusha, with your kind of, with boldly, without any kind of compunction, and expect God to hear this. What God should turn around and say is, stop lying to me. I know what I said. This is not what I said. You want to appeal to me, to my mercy? Then tell the truth about what I said. But it's worse. Because this principle of is not just a hypothetical principle. As disturbing as this may be, there are countless examples in the Tanakh, which we're going to look at briefly, that make it clear that God doesn't just make this proclamation. Namely, that the idea that sin passes on to a cross-generational, are we okay? Cross-generational punishment. It's not something that's foreign to the biblical tradition. And we're going to take a few examples. Take a look, for example, at Bereshit. I'm going to do some flipping, some quick flipping. Bereshit, Perek Zayin, Pasuk Aleph. We're just, these are a few samples of many throughout the time. Perek Zayin, Pasuk Aleph, and Bereshit. ויאמר השם לנוח, בוא אתה וכל ביתך אל התקווה, יוכל האיש צדיק לפניי בדור. Who's the righteous guy? Who's the righteous person? Who? Noah. Who's being saved? Noah.
And he's got
And his family. Why is his family being saved? Noah's the righteous guy. Let's continue. How about Bereshit? This is a few samples throughout the Tanakh. Perek Kavav and Bereshit. Perek Kavav and Bereshit. Psukim, Dalet, and Hay. I'm sorry, I don't have fast forward in terms of flipping. Are you okay? Good. Perek Kavav. God speaking to Abraham. I will make your heirs as numerous as the stars of heaven. And I assign to their heirs all these lands, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by you. Because inasmuch as Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my laws, and my decrees. Who's the tzaddik here? Abraham. Who are the beneficiaries? All his children, all generations. To this very day. So is this cross-generational? Of course it's cross-generational. One guy was the tzaddik, and we're all benefiting from it. And we, by the way, we employ that throughout the tefillah. Brit avot, zechor brit avot, right? Zechut avot. The merit of our forefathers, we got to forget, because that's part of the system. The system, at least, was certainly the biblical tradition very much has this as a centerpiece. Let me give you one more example on this side. Let's take a look at, there are many others. Look in Bamidbar Perek Kafeh. Pasuk Yud. Beginning Parshat Pinchas. Perek Pei. Pasuk Yud. וידבר השם משה לבני. פנחס בן אלעזר בן אהרון הכהן השיב את חמתי מעל בני ישראל וקנו את קנאתי בתוכם ולא כיליתי את בני ישראל בקנאתי. Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, has turned back my wrath in the Israelites by displaying among his passion for me, etc. Stay there. Therefore, I'm giving him a pact of friendship. It shall be for him and his descendants after they pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, thus making expiation for Israel. Who's the tzaddik? Good guy. That's not using tzaddik. Who's the good guy? Pinchas. Who are the beneficiaries? All his descendants for eternity. Cross-generational reward. But now let's see the flip side. This is the unfortunate flip side. Take a look at Pasuk. I'm sorry. No, you're quick. Pasuk Lamed Bet. This is the story of Korach. I'm sorry, Pasuk Lamed Bet. Did I say that? Lamed Bet. 32. ותפתח הארץ את פיה, ותבלע אותם בתיהם ואת כל האדם אשר לקוח ביתו. Who's the sinner?
They went with him.
Not his children. There were 250 people. There were the Sept, there was the Middot, there was the Harbater, but nowhere does it say this family sin. But who's being swallowed along with it? His whole family. But it's not there. It's not just there. How about Sefer Shmuel? Sefer Shmuel Bet. Perek Bet. You guys have something Rashim פה. זה אמור לעשות רש"י כל הזמן? שמואל ב' פרק י"ב.
זה עדיין עושה לשם?
לא, עכשיו זה לא. Okay, what happens? You don't all know the famous sin of David in Bathsheba. The lowest point that David reached in his career. Terrible, terrible, shameful situation. Anyway, so what does he do? What does God say? Because you took the horrible thing that you did. Pasuk Yud. כה אמר השם, הנני מקים עליך רעה מביתך, ולקחתי את נשיך לעיניך, ונתתי לרעך ושבת נחשיך I did that. I will take your wives and give them to other men before your very eyes, etc. כי אתה עשית בסתר, ואני אעשה בדבר הזה, so punishing the wives. Then David asks for forgiveness. And then, okay, Pasuk Yud Daled, Pasuk Yud Daled, thank you very much, Pasuk Yud Daled. אפס כי ניאץ ניאץ לדודי השם בדבר הזה, גם הבן הילוד לך מות ימות. Even the child about to be born to you shall die. And he dies. What did the son do? He's an innocent victim. But he's suffering the consequences.
And also just the fact that Rabbi decided to do the census and look at how many people there were, and as a result, 7,000 people died.
It goes on and on. The list goes on. This is just, you know what? I don't even want to look. Yerovam's son dies because of Yerovam. The sins of Baashar visited upon Elah. The sins of Achab visited upon Sept. It goes on and on and on and on. In fact, there's even one pasuk that suggests that the entire Churban is a result of the sins of Menashe, King Menashe. Intergenerational, cross-generational reward and punishment. You can't understand the Tanakh without it. You can't. Whether we like it or not, that's the shot. God rewards and God punishes. And there is a theological or philosophical explanation for this. And that is, it's very consistent in Judaism. The same way we see it, we're linking a chain of tradition. We don't just live in the present, especially if you read Sefer Dorim. Sefer Dorim, Moshe is always talking to people now who are about to enter the land. He keeps saying, you witnessed my miracle. You did this. Right? What do you mean? What are you talking about? It's my parents. Okay. Generation, previous generation. And then he says, we saw it last week. We said, ולא איתכם לבדכם אנוכי קובע את הברית הזאת. כי אם את אשר ישנו פה ואת אשר איננו עמנו, right? I established the covenant with you and those who were not here. The present is connected, is the past, and present, right? We're speaking to the present as though what happened in the past is occurring now, and what will occur in the future is also, in a sense, okay, they're present now. And it's a different way of looking at the world. We think in terms of past, present, and future. We think of separating generations. What am I responsible for my parents? Why are my parents responsible for me? But the Torah's outlook largely, it's not like that. To understand and appreciate this, you have to step outside our very individualistic Western liberal mindset. It just is. Of course. Like,
I realize there's a problem about the hearing, but I just want to say I learned in literature.
yes.
There's such an irony in our world, in our Jewish world, in the soul world. We talk about the word acharei, and that's after. And acharei means is the so, is the so. But you have let's say kadima, which goes forward, like the mekedem were in the past, and it's the east. And there's such a crossover, there's such a crossover between future and past, the temporal and the makom.
Beautiful.
And it's very much linked to what this is saying right
Beautiful.
now, because I've had since I studied that, I'm so puzzled. What does it mean to talk about the future and the past, and it crosses over?
Beautiful. Listen, and you think about Pesach, what's Pesach, right? What's the essential mitzvah of Pesach? To feel, right? To feel as though you yourself are coming out of it. If we don't feel that, we haven't achieved the goal of this. We can only say we fulfilled it partially, unless we relive it and re-experience it. Feel as if we today left Egypt, then we haven't fully fulfilled this. It's all about. It's about the past and the future and the present all merging into one. And so the question that I'm asking is even straight. If it's not just God telling the people, or Moshe, that these are my attributes, but there's a theological meaning behind it. There's a philosophical significance to the idea of cross-generational punishment. It makes sense from a particular world. And how can we just ignore that when we're reciting the central tefillah of Yom Kippur, repeat it over and over and over again, distorting the text and omitting the part that God, right, uttered in his own words to Moshe. Okay. By the way, how do I even know, right? If there's any question that Al-Banin is negative or is retribution or is a form of punishment, I want to look briefly in Shemot Perikov. Look at Shemot Perikov. If there's even a semblance of a doubt that these words imply something negative, or again, the word negative, punishment, consequence, retribution. Take a look at the Sept Pasuk Hey. Lo tishtacha belehem velo ta'odeh. Right? This is a Sept. Ki anochi Hashem Elokecha, because I'm God. Now let's continue. Elkana. What is he saying there? What's the context? What's the goal here? He's telling them, don't bow down to other gods. Because I am what is it? Because I'm an impassioned God visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, the third and fourth generation. And so, this is meant to scare them, to frighten them away from bowing down to gods. There is no way one could read the same words that appear later on in Sefer Shemot in the context of the revelation of the Middot of God. If you start earlier, it's virtually the same words, right? We'll go back to Perek Lamed Daled, we saw earlier. I lost it. Yeah. Poked avon avot al banim, al shirishim al nibiim. So, in case someone would perhaps suggest that that's not really punishment or retribution, it's clear that it is. Because that's the point of mentioning it in the context of Sarah, that they go to scare people away from bowing down. So our question is magnified. But if you look carefully in the text we just read, there is one word that could soften the blow. Look carefully in Shemot Perek Kaf we just read. Compare it to Shemot Perek Lamed Daled that we read earlier. And there's one word that can soften the blow a little bit. See if you can pick it up. What'd you say? Listen, I. And what does it say in the next person? Vai. Listen carefully. It's a slight change, but it's important. Because I'll pick them on this. See, it sounds like retribution glory. There's a little nuance here that suggests an error. When does God inflict punishment of the parents upon the children? When? What did you say? Listen, the children have to be people who themselves reject it. Listen, people who reject or hate me. And when does he extend the goodness? The Ohava. In other words, what appeared, or at least the Perek Lamed Daled, what appears as cross-generational reward and punishment, having nothing to do with the behavior of the next generation, the following generation. At least in Shemot Perek Kaf, there is some link. God will inflict the punishment of the parents on the third and fourth generation, only on condition that what? That the third and fourth generation themselves are continuing to reject God. Then their punishment is double and triple, because they're also punished for their own behavior and for the parents. But it's not like they're totally innocent. According to Shemot Perek Kaf, if they're innocent, completely innocent, they will not be punished for the sins of their father and mother. And conversely, if they are not good people, then they don't merit of their father. Now that little addition appears in Shemot Perek Kaf. It doesn't appear in Shemot Perek Lamed Daled, which is fascinating. Because when God reveals his Middot in Perek Lamed Daled, he doesn't say that. He just says, Poked avon avot al bnei banim. So, which is right? I don't know. And this is, but Chazal read Perek Kaf into Perek Lamed Daled. They read the word l'sonai and the havai into, even though Perek Lamed Daled doesn't qualify the Poked avon avot al banim the way Perek Kaf does, they read it that way to reconcile Perek Kaf and Perek Lamed. And so Chazal at a certain level, even the Torah, softens the blow. Yes, you'll get punished for the sins of your parents and grandparents, but only if you yourself continue in their way. On the other hand, it softens the blow, but it doesn't completely erase the blow. Why not? Why doesn't it completely erase the blow?
Because it's not always true. David's baby.
Okay, it doesn't so because it's not always true in terms of the Tanakh, but what for theologically speaking? Why doesn't it erase the blow? Okay, but that makes sense. But it's still, what is the Torah saying? Even according to Perek Kaf, what the Torah is saying. that if I am a sinner, if I reject God, then finish the sentence.
Then I will have retribution.
Retribution for what?
Often,
Okay. Then the retribution will be not just for my own sins, but also for the sins of my predecessors. So on a certain level, I have to deserve, I have to do something to justify, right, the punishment being inflicted upon me for my parents at the same time, right? But from a sort of modern contemporary liberal point of view, it's still unfair. I should be punished for my own sins.
But then we've got the nekra.
No, there are many, many examples where, like I said, and there are many that I didn't cite. You can go on and on throughout the time. See examples of this nonsense.
I'm saying the nekra who did to that. And
Well, we don't know what they did. Just they're not mentioned. We don't know what they
No,
did.
but in the first thing we read before we blow the shofar. That
So that's more
those who
problematic.
did- No, but it deals with your parent, your parent.
Very nice. Very, very nice. Again,
Why?
beautiful. So that proves.
In other words, if they do Tuba, that's the example of
Okay, right, but that's the good. What I'm saying, but still, it's one thing. I think we're okay. I think most of us are okay with receiving the reward for our previous generations. I think it's more difficult to accept that we're to be doubly, triply punished, right? Even if we're
So
bad.
what I'm saying
Yeah.
is that these people chose to leave the path of their father, which was not good. And we see that they were not punished for the sins of.
But I understand. Well, okay, so this is an exception, you said.
I'm saying it proves
Yeah. Right, that you could change your ways, yes. Okay.
You
Listen,
can change your ways and you do not get the retribution that was coming because.
but
of your
still,
father.
even if I continue on the ways, why should I be punished more than my just deserves? In other words, now, when did this all come to a head? I'll tell you when this all came to a head. Take a look at Eicha. I want you to take a look at Megillat Eicha. Perek Hey. Plus exact. I'm sorry, Perek Megillat Eicha, the end of the Megillah, it's right before Kohelet, before it's in the middle of the Chamesh Megillot, which is before Sefer Daniel, okay, which is after Dio. Perek Hey of Eicha. Now, unlike the other Prakim of Eicha, this Perek in particular seems to be pointing fingers at God. Perek Hey. Unlike the other Prakim, the focus of this section is that people are bemoaning their situation as opposed to doing introspection. What did we do? There's a sense here in this Perek at least that they're saying, how could this be? In other words, it seems unfair, all the horrors that are happening to them. And in a sense, they're confronting God. Remember at the beginning of Perek Hey. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us, behold and see our disgrace. Our heritage is passed to aliens. They're bemoaning the circumstances. And then they have one pasuk that's critical. Pasuk Zayin. Avotenu chatu be'inam, v'anachnu avonotehem savam. Our fathers sinned no more, and we must bear their. Now that's tough. That's very challenging. Because it's one thing to say that you were punished because of your sins. The korban happened because of your behavior. But it's quite another to say that you're suffering the consequences of your parents or previous generations. Now, clearly this is what people were feeling. This was an underlying feeling of resentment that the system whereby there's cross-generational punishment is too much to bear. It cannot be that our lives have been turned upside down Not only because anything we've done, but because previous generations. And hearing this, the great Jewish spiritual leaders could not turn a blind eye, a deaf ear. They couldn't ignore. They could. But this is very powerful. And if the people are feeling, what helped people get through the Purim? What was likely to help people get through the Purim is the belief that if we deserve this, if only we correct our ways, we can turn things around.
Jimmy also said, build houses, make families, it's gonna be okay.
It's going to be okay
He gave them.
if they listen to it. But here, this is different. It's a different perspective, saying this is beyond us. What do you want us to do? What do you want us to do? We're suffering because of our forefathers, our ancestors. We're doomed. If we're judged not just based on our actions, but based on previous generations, what are we supposed to do? But there was one prophet who listened. There was one very important prophet of the Galut, who listened to this call and responded. Open up Sefer Yechezkel, Perek Yudches. Remember, Yechezkel was exiled along with Yehoiachin. He went to Babel. He's essentially the prophet of the Galut. And whatever complaints the people had, I'm sure he heard. And he had to address them. And this one was very unsettling. And so let's read it. He's repeating a nevuah that he gets finished. What do you mean by quoting this proverb upon the soil of Israel? Parents eat sour grapes and their children's teeth are black. What does that mean? What does that mean? What is the common phrase, this idiom that goes around? Parents eat sour grapes and their children's teeth are blunt. What is that? What's another word for that? Okay, that's all. The people were walking around saying what we just read. What is this? It's not fair. They sinned. And our teeth are blunted because of that. This is probably everyone in every household will probably scream this. But here's where the revolution takes place. There's a nevuah from God. As I live, declares the Lord. As I live, because Lord, this program shall no longer be current among Israel. Consider all lives are mine. The life of the parent and the life of the child are both mine. The person who sins, only he shall die. And look again in Pasuk Kaf, same parent. Hanefesh hachotet hi tamut. Ben lo yisa ba'avon ha'av. Ve'av lo yisa ba'avon ha'ben. Tzidkat hatzadik alav tiyeh. Ve'rishat rasha alav tiyeh. The person who sins, he alone shall die. A child should not share the burden of a parent's guilt, nor shall a parent share the burden of a child's guilt. The righteousness of the righteous shall be accounted to him alone, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be accounted to him alone. What is God pronouncing? What is going on here? He's what? They're laughing. But that's exactly what's going on. God is changing his mind. Maybe in some ideal world there was cross-training, it's generational passion. But as a result of this system, that God said, or the world set up, and God part of the world at the time, causes people such distress and despair that they can't function. They can't pick up their lives from the ruins of the Korban. If they lose faith in God and His justice and fairness, that God has to accommodate, and He has to change the rules of the game. We can no longer go with this cross-generational stuff and expect people after the Korban to pick up their lives and start all over again with hope and optimism. So He changes the rules of the game. And I'll even go one step further. This is my reading into the text. I think that God wants to be seen by the people as a just and fair and moral God. And God can't allow Himself to be seen as immoral. And so, whether this was His original intention or not, the circumstances now forced a change. No longer. Now each man or woman is his own, or her. You'll be held accountable for your sins and your sins.
On Yom Kippur especially.
Correct. Except we do mention the corporate vote. So on the one hand, we take the reward from our ancestors, but not necessarily the punishment. But certainly it's the foundation of those we love. And so here's a change. Change in the way God runs the world. Post-corporate. But what does that mean? That means that there was a time pre-Korban when God was seen as being, that God's behavior or the way he conducted affairs of the world were seen as somewhat immoral, problematic. Let's put it that. If you had to change, that means that in retrospect, looking back on the way God managed the world prior to the Korban, and it meant that people could look back and say that, well, why did God ever rule the world differently? Chazal were apparently bothered by the notion that God could have ever conducted the world differently than what Yechezkel describes. Even though we saw that it's clear. It's clear both from Shmot Perikah, certainly Shmot Perikah Ramadan, from the numerous, countless examples of the way this system works in reality. Nevertheless, Chazal apparently were troubled by the notion that God ever could have run the world this way. And how do I know this? Take a look at text number 6. But before we look at text number 6, we have to look at another text in Sept because we won't understand what it's talking about. There's a text in Sept that has been understood in different ways. Where is it? The text, the source. Hold on. Not right where it is. Written it. Sorry. Yeah, Sefer Dvarim. You could say maybe it makes sense as in 2 cases. I'm sorry I didn't write down the source. Sure. Nefesh Otit. Hold on. I'm sorry, I don't know why I didn't write it down. One second. Yes, thank you. Perek Tetzayin in Dvarim? No. Sure. What pasuk? What Perek? I'm sorry, yes, go ahead. What Perek? What? Yutet. Okay, thank you. Pasuk what? No, in Perek Yutet there's no Kavzayin.
So then it's Kavdalit?
Hold on. Kavdalit in Perek?
Perek Kavdalit?
Yes. Okay. Why not a fight again? Perek Abdallah Pasuk Tetzai. Yes, you are right. Perek Abdallah Pasuk Tetzai. Lo yimtu avot al banim ubanim lo yimtu al avot ish bechet oluman. What does it sound like? It sounds exactly like Yechezkel. Parents shall not be put to death for children, or children be put to death for parents. A person to be put to death only for his own crime. Now, many, both traditional and modern commentaries suggest this has nothing to do with God's judgment. It has to do with what the court system. There's a huge difference between the way God conducts the affairs of the world and the way the court system does. And so many commentators suggest this has nothing to do with what we're discussing. It's not the way God conducts the affairs of the world, but the way the courts cannot put to death. Put to death is what courts, they issue right death penalties. And so this may have nothing to do with our discussion. However,
because it's saying that on a human level, that we are going to be more ethical than what our historical is going to be. Thinking that something is a big item.
it's not, let's say, so if it refers to the human court system, then it's, you're right. Well, then it raises an ethical question. How could we be held to a higher standard than God himself? But in fact, there are those
How can God set us a higher standard?
set for us a higher standard than he himself adheres. Okay. Okay, so, but there are those, as we'll see in a moment, who actually interpret this in right and say this is referring to God's system, in which case it's echoing Yechezkel or Yechezkel's upward. But which means there's an inherent tension in the Torah between Sefer Shemot, which applies, which says, Pokeda. Okay. So Chazal understood it that way, and they addressed this fascinating. Take a look at text number 6. Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. Avar gzerot gazal Moshe Rabbeinu al Yisrael. Ba'u arba nevi'im u'bitlum. There are 4 gzerot, decrees, that Moshe declared on Am Yisrael. And 4 nevi'im canceled them. Moshe amar poked avon avot habanim. Vayechezkel u'bitlam hanefesh hachoteh yitamu. What's the twist here? Correct. The notion that poked avon avot al banim was never God in the first place. God would never issue such a statement, even though it appears that God does. But at least according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, no, that was Moshe's utterance. And Yechezkel came and annulled this rule. In other words, it's not a tension between the God, right? God versus God, the early version of God and the late version of God. Because at least Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina's point of view, God could never have issued something. Who was it? It was Moshe versus Yechezkel. I mean, it's a shocking reading into the text. In what sense?
In the sense that we believe Torah, Moshe, Sinai, Formula, so now we're supposed to say that sometimes we interpret the translation as that.
That's another shear. That's another shear.
That's very dangerous.
Wonderful. That's another shear in another context. There's a lot of fantastic material, but it's a wonderful one. Text number 7. In my opinion, is even more dramatic. Even more dramatic. Let's read this. זה אחד מגימל דברים שאמר משה לפני הקדוש ברוך הוא ואמר לו לימד תני. I'm going to repeat and say it's hard to believe what I'm going to say, but these words are inconceivable, incomprehensible, but they're written here in Bamidbarav. This is one of the 3 things that Moshe said before God. God said, thank you for teaching me this. And I'm skipping 2 of them because they're not relevant to our talks. But what's one of them? When God said, now, unlike Yossi Bar Chanina, right? The Chazal here are attributing to whom? To God. To God. Shamano goes before Amar Moshe, Ribono Shel Olam. How many evil people have given birth to tzaddikim? They should suffer the consequences of their fathers. Abraham ben tzaddik. Terach was an idol worshiper, and Abraham was a tzaddik. We should suffer the sins of his father. How could this be, God? How can you utter such a statement? That's not fair, because based on that logic, Abraham should be suffering for the sins of his father. Thank you, Moshe, for teaching this. I swear these are not my words. I am canceling my words. And fulfill your words. שנאמר, לא יומתו אבות על בנים, ובנים לא יומתו על אבות, איש בחטא יומת. The pasuk in Sept. בחייך שאני כותבן איש בחטא שנה, כתוב בספר תורת משה אשר ציווה השם, and I'm attributing this, right, and saying the Torah is named after you, for teaching you. Three things, of which this is one. Again, what is he saying? You, Moshe, taught me, guided me to a higher level of morality, of fairness. I said, but you said, good point, Moshe. I accept it wholeheartedly. So according to this, who's the one who originally said, Hashem. And why does Sefer Devarim suddenly say, who says that? Who says that? It says Devarim, who says that? Moshe. And who wins at the end of the day? Moshe. I didn't make this up. You can't make this stuff up.
The second question is about readjustments in being changed. The whole story of first out and first in of the
Guys, I'm writing a book about this. I can't. This is a drop in the sea. That's it. I'm writing a book.
I'm saying in
Of course.
And it's talking about the ideal of creation as opposed to practical application.
Let's get back to a real question. How did Chazal have the nerve, the tefillah have a nerve to uproot, to undermine the very core of the text, to skip that whole section of Pokeda, to turn Venakeh Lo Yanakeh into Venakeh, to turn what is pshat, is an attribute of justice and retribution, into an attribute of mercy. What right did they have to do that?
Because what is the whole purpose? The whole purpose is to get the person to do tshuva. And how can you do it if you're going to say, in any case, you cannot free yourself?
But how could we lie to God is my question. How do we stand in front of God and lie to his face and it's like, you know what newspaper, when you very often, it doesn't ever happen to me, but I'm sure you know people who have been interviewed by the press. And what always happens afterwards, it gets distorted. And you get angry. It's not what I said. How dare you print that, put that into print? You completely undermined, you uprooted, you turned, you twisted my words so you can sell your newspaper. That's exactly what the tefillah is doing to God. What God should be saying is, what on earth are you doing? You're twisting my words. You want to make people feel good, so twist my words. And you expect me to listen? You expect to evoke my sympathy by twisting my words and lying about who I am? I am a merciful God, but I also believe in divine retribution and punishment. What I'm suggesting is, in light of what we just saw and the changes, either from the time of Yechezkel or, according to the last source, already from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, God was forced to change his thinking. And so, while it's true that God pronounced. Either that was changed by the time of Yechezkel, or already Moshe convinced God to change his mind, to change his ways. And so in a certain sense, by omitting that last section, we're simply following the path that either Yechezkel charted or that Moshe, in light of his conversation with God, charted as well. Or put it differently, with this I conclude. This is my own reading. Why does this have such a huge impact? And by reciting it so many times, why does it suddenly have such an impact that God cannot walk away untouched by the words that we recite, even though the words are not his words or the distortion of his words? Because they remind God, this is my reading, my midrash on this, of the tshuva that he did. He did tshuva for having such a harsh way of running the world. So why can't help but respond when we utter the words? Because if these words reflect God's own tshuva, how could he reject or turn a blind eye to our attempt to do tshuva when we recite these words as well?